Much like love, history actually is all around us. From architecture to Magna Carta, the skeletons of medieval Europe matter just as much today, especially when it comes to video games. Whether you're founding an empire, fighting as a Knight Templar, or platforming as a Bandicoot, real history can be dug up from the unlikeliest of games. I'm Hanley from Norwich Castle, and in celebration of our Royal Palace Reborn project, which is reverting the castle to how it looked in medieval times, I'm going to prove to you just how much you're learning every time you pick up a controller. In Crash Bandicoot Warped, you play as the eponymous marsupial, warping through time using the time-twisting machine created by Dr. Entropy, but how good are his path-finding skills? In all three European medieval levels, Toad Village, G-Wiz and Doubleheader, we follow a straightforward path leading up to a distant castle, with the bonus levels giving us a glimpse of the externals, with their wooden construction platforms remaining just below the ramparts for reasons? We're going to apply the Assassin's Creed logic of having random wooden bits sticking out of your walls here. Gaming history is important too. Did you know that AC3's Nine Men's Morris minigame dates back to the Romans and was much loved in the medieval era? We think they'd have probably preferred Crash though. We'll start simple with the walls and pathways. Straight walls is something we all take for granted these days, but there's no way they did it in medieval times. Oh, no, sorry, they did. See, ingenious medieval builders employed a tool called a plumb line to create a vertical reference from the ground, and that kept their wall straight. That's why Norwich castles are nearly as straight as Warped's perfect computer-generated lines, not to mention it's still standing nearly 1,000 years later. And yes, the metal bit on the end of the plumb line is called a plumb bob. See? Gaming history. While we're on medieval construction, let's talk about those barriers. Most wooden furniture at the time would have been held together by wooden pegs. Nails were expensive. Think of all those hours of resource gathering for iron, which you also need to make weaponry, armour, and restrain your enemies. It took blacksmiths a few days to make nails in large quantities, so while they would have been in the doors of homes otherwise made from wood, clay, and animal poo, nails in these barriers mean the castle owner is seriously showing off his wealth, especially as construction of the castle itself already costs multi-millions in today's money. I wonder how many games you could buy for that. Those structures at the side are worth mentioning too. The tents are undoubtedly military, as waterproof cloth is so far into the future that you wouldn't camp unless you were absolutely desperate, or part of the army and absolutely forced to. That's why you always stay inns in medieval set games. Nothing to do with reusing assets, of course. So, what about our enemies? We first come across the goats, which weirdly are of much debate to medieval historians, as it's harder to tell the difference between goats and sheep than you might think. So, for an archaeologist, telling the bones apart is basically a boss battle. All current evidence, though, points to goats being really rare in medieval England, and this, combined with them being decked out in purple, an extremely expensive colour due to the rarity and complexity of how it was made, is making me start to think that Cortex and his gang might have a high opinion of themselves. How good are goats as guards anyway? Ah, fair enough. Medieval Christian tradition, based on an ancient text called the Physiologus, which I definitely pronounced wrong, held that land frogs were righteous and water frogs sinful, so Crash is probably doing a good thing to the medieval mind by banishing these amphibious creatures. Oh, and despite the level name, that is definitely a frog. Toads have shorter legs and don't like to hop. Naughty dog! As for the knights, in terms of their swords, sorry to disappoint you, but much like mobile phones today, it's highly likely that most people living in the medieval era just called a sword a sword. What can be said for this sword is that it does date us a little. It's probably closest to a claymore sword, a Scottish sword which translates as great sword. Claymores were used in the late medieval period and, somewhat unsurprisingly, saw a lot of use in Scottish battles. They require two hands to hold, making the user vulnerable in a lot of situations. but boy can they slice you in two when they want to. Probably not as effectively as they do here though. Magic in medieval times was seen by many as a very real threat, though they probably didn't put as much spellcasting into their outfits as is done here. By the time the infamous set of witch trials came around, such trials were simply old wizards' hats. As seen in game series such as The Witcher and Dragon Age, as the Middle Ages progressed, witch trials became less about justice and more about an excuse to literally kill off a subculture in your community. The blame somewhat lies at the feet of the Malleus Maleficarum, which pretty much laid out how to accuse and persecute someone for witchcraft. Of course, that somebody was usually a woman, so the use of an evil Merlin type probably was the best way to go here. On to a happier topic, the beloved but sadly absent element of the original PAL version of the game, where a defeated wizard is stripped down to his underwear. That's actually a little closer to accuracy, given how medieval underwear was pretty similar to boxer shorts. Are you ready for the most surprising thing you'll hear today? Two-headed trolls famously roamed around the Norfolk coastline, excited to gobble up any invading Vikings. Or they actually hail from Scandinavian folklore, and are a great example of the mingling of various European folklore in the modern day. The description of trolls varies, and the word has many origins, but ultimately they were known to be inhuman, evil, and likely related to magic. So all the things you know about trolls from more recent fiction does have roots as deep as the oldest trees on Earth. Speaking of the ground, the water pits are probably accurate, as castles took a lot of water to build, and so were often close to water sources such as rivers, and the pits themselves could probably be caved in potholes. In medieval times, cooking pots were made of clay gathered as locally as possible, usually from the side of the road, and we all know how badly things can go when you hit a pothole. Onto the bonus levels, and unfortunately, medieval stained glass looks nothing like the reproduction seen here, although points will be given for its appearance, as we are solidly in the height of medieval fashion with the stained glass windows. We even know how they were made, thanks to someone bothering to write it all down in a fascinating book called The Diverse Arts, which is definitely worth reading if you want to understand some of the history behind crafting systems. While stained glass was more common in churches, which is why you're likely picturing windows showcasing religious figures right now, it wasn't unheard of in castles, and given the rest of the opulence here, having seemingly every window stained makes total sense for Cortex and his gang. The other famous holes in the walls are perhaps the most recognisable element of medieval castles, the arrow slits, tiny 3-inch wide windows which were part of the genius of medieval warfare. Inside, these windows branch out into a triangle, with the bottom sloping downwards, allowing the defending archer full movement and vision of his prey, while the attackers desperately tried to aim into these small gaps, which the defending archers were probably nowhere near due to the sheer amount of space on their side. Basically, they could have made this level a lot harder if they chose to. Thanks for not making us take the high road. So, did you know more than you thought? Or is Dr. Entropy's degree definitely not in history? If you'd like to find out more about Royal Palace Reborn, or Norwich Castle itself, take a look at the links in the description. You can also support the project by heading to adoptanobject.co.uk and adopting an object, such as this stained glass roundel or this decorated dog tile. Remind you of anyone? Unfortunately, all the spots for the bollock-dagger have gone. It's actually a thing, and we look forward to you seeing it in person when Royal Palace Reborn opens to the public in 2022. Thanks for watching.